Daniel Lazare is a journalist, author, and commentator who specializes in critically analyzing the politics and constitution of the United States. He has authored several books, including The Velvet Revolution and The Decline of American Democracy. Daniel Lazare, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Daniel, as a glaring example of US government not working, let's look at the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic over the past 2 years. The American death toll has reached over 1 million, which is by far the greatest number of deaths compared with any other nation. So my first question to you is, what does this extraordinary death toll indicate about American capitalist society?
Well, it indicates a lot of things, but I mean, the first thing to bear in mind is that America is a severely dysfunctional society. It doesn't serve its citizens very well. There's a very low level of democracy. There's a tremendous growing discrepancies in wealth. The government really is beholden to the top 1%. And very neglectful of those below. The problem is that government is so antiquated and so inefficient, and therefore so scattered in terms of its programs and their results. And COVID just showed this to a T. I mean, first of all, we had a president, Donald Trump, who was not popularly elected. He was chosen according to an antiquated system that is more than 2 centuries old, in which the popular will was trumped. His opponent, Hillary Clinton, whatever you think of her, and I don't think very much of her, but nonetheless, she won by nearly 3 million votes. But Donald Trump wound up waltzing into the White House, courtesy of the Electoral College, this incredibly antiquated institution that Americans can't get rid of. And once COVID-19 hit in early 2020, I mean, it just sort of showed Trump at his very weakest. I mean, he is personally an ignorant man. He's intemperate. He's paranoid. He was making all kinds of erratic comments. You probably remember those comments about about bleach being useful in halting the disease, and even suggested injecting bleach, which was just completely appalling. But he was issuing nonsensical statements by the week. I mean, he was insisting the corner had been turned within a few weeks of the appearance of the epidemic, when it was clear that the crisis was actually intensifying. He countermanded his own bureaucracy. He penalized health officials for putting out worrisome reports because he wanted to make everything look good to benefit himself politically at the polls. I mean, it was a real disaster, and public health officials found themselves stymied at every turn by Trump and his completely erratic, incompetent behavior. But underlying that is, first of all, a dysfunctional political system, an extreme federal system in which there's a very complicated system of power sharing between the federal government and the 50 states. And essentially, the federal government has very limited powers. It can only intervene very sporadically at the local level. And state officials were often sending conflicting messages that they were trying to countermand federal health policies. So there was complete chaos. But even at a more fundamental level, I mean, the American health profile is dreadful. 40% of adults are obese. No country spends more on healthcare per capita than the U.S., and no country has worse outcomes per dollar spent. Diseases like heart disease, obesity, and similar issues are through the roof, completely off the charts relative to other countries. U.S. Life expectancy has been sort of flatlining since around 2016 or 17, but then took a deep plunge during COVID, completely diverging from the record of comparable countries in terms of economic development. Americans are very poorly served by their government, and there are important consequences.
This transcends just Donald Trump. I mean, it's not just Donald Trump is the problem here. It's the general federal government, whether Democrat or Republican. I mean, he just happened to be an acute manifestation of the deficiencies and problems, but it transcends Trumpism.
Oh yes, I mean, Trumpism is a product of this completely dysfunctional system, but then Trump aggravated its worst tendencies. Mm. So there was complete chaos, and health outcomes plummeted, and Americans are paying the cost for a system that is increasingly antiquated and increasingly undemocratic. I mean, it reflects itself in actually the growing ill health of the population. It's amazing. Americans don't exercise because they can't exercise. Their streets are crowded with cars, and there are no sidewalks. They can't ride a bike for fear of getting run over by a car. They can't take a stroll because there's nowhere to walk. They're trapped in their houses. The food itself is horrible. It's industrialized food of the worst type. Americans they have very due to the economic pressures, they're forced to work odd hours. This little family time. Families don't eat meals together. People grab food out of the refrigerator when they have a chance, and it's very bad food. So there's poor food, poor exercise. I think the latest figure is 27 million Americans lack any kind of health care insurance. People die because they don't have access to hospitals. It's a dreadful situation that Trump aggravated, but he did not cause. He simply, as you say, simply is a manifestation of this governmental crisis.
Daniel, let me ask you, just on the extraordinary death toll figure of the United States. I mean, 1 million. It's out on its own, by comparison to other nations. And I mean, China, by stark contrast, China's death toll is roughly 5,000, something like that. I mean, whether you accept that exact figure, but it's the magnitude of the difference between the United States and China. China's death toll is about 0.5% of the US death toll. And I'm just wondering, does China's success in protecting public health demonstrate that widespread death and disease are not inevitable, as in the US and in other Western states?
Yeah, I mean, yes. I mean, first of all, China is not perfect. China is getting itself in trouble. There are problems with the Chinese approach, certainly. But on a per capita basis, the Chinese death rate was 99.9% less than the U.S. death rate. What can one say? That's an extraordinary figure. And the U.S. system is, it's just completely captured by private corporate interests. The healthcare system is milked for profits. It's absolutely extraordinary. Yeah. So Americans spend more and have worse outcomes than any other comparable country. Mm-hmm. It's a complete scandal, and it shows. I mean, it shows absolutely clearly that that profits are more important than lives.
Yeah.
And China. I mean, China has immense problems, immense political problems, but nonetheless, I think that that Chinese communism, despite all the Stalinist deformations, um, uh, uh, still is more advanced and in a way more progressive and more democratic even when it comes to valuing the lives of its citizens.
Right.
And the U.S. is just completely backwards and completely anti-humanistic in
Yeah.
this regard.
I mean, China's being accused recently again of being authoritarian in regard to its zero COVID policy. But at least China has prioritized putting public health above economic interests. Whereas in the United States, as you've just eloquently described, the paramount priority seems to be the maximizing of private profit over public health. And so, is that American and Western priority of profit over public health not more damning than allegations made against China of having a heavy-handed zero COVID policy?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, yes. I mean sick people are the U.S. regards sick people as an asset to be milked by private interests. It's absolutely extraordinary.
Mm.
Yeah. I mean, China clearly has gotten itself into a hole. Its vaccine is not as good as the Western vaccines. Its population is under vaccinated, and especially its elderly population, the ones most at risk, are severely under vaccinated, and it has a non-existent public health care system, which is scandalous for a supposedly socialist country. But that said, their record is literally 1,000 times better than that of the U.S.
Yeah.
And that's extraordinary. So that China is far from perfect, but still, it's compared to the U.S., it's practically utopian.
um, Daniel, let's turn to elections now. So in the United States, the midterm elections there in November, just a few weeks ago, it appeared to observers in this part of the world, at least, that the U.S. voters didn't seem to be attracted to either of the main parties. And I'm just wondering, is the United States drifting towards authoritarianism due to a growing discontent or disillusionment with the established political choices?
Well, first of all, I think the word drift is incorrect. I think gallop would be a bit more appropriate verb. Listen, political democracy is in trouble around the world. I mean, every country is gripped by a growing political crisis in which basic democratic functions seem to be breaking down. But the U.S. is clearly setting the pace in this regard. The recent midterms, people don't understand what happened in the midterms. The midterms actually did see a surge in support for the Republican Party, which got 50.9% of the total House of Representatives vote versus only 47.3%. I believe that's correct for the Democrats. So the Republicans led by 3.6%, which is a pretty hefty margin. They got fewer seats in the House than they would normally be entitled to due to the vagaries of the U.S. constitutional system. But they have captured the lower house, and they are using that to wage war on the Biden administration. And the war will start on January 1st when the new Congress takes office. And it will be ferocious. I guarantee it'll lead to a dramatic increase in political tensions in the U.S. The Biden administration is highly vulnerable. The political anger will just soar from the already levels that are already extraordinarily high. So American democracy is heading for a major breakdown.
And why would those tensions, those very bitter bipartisan tensions, why would that lead to increasing authoritarianism? What's the
Because there's the system, the American constitutional system, which dates from 1787, if you can believe it. I mean, it's more than 2 centuries old. It's wildly dysfunctional, and it promotes gridlock. It's a gridlock machine. In other words, rather than allowing the majority to have its way, it allows minorities to essentially veto the majority indefinitely, leading to protracted showdowns on Capitol Hill that just send tensions rising. And the higher the tensions soar, and the more any kind of democratic resolution, the more that possibility recedes, the more there is a turn towards undemocratic, semi-constitutional means. We saw that with Russiagate beginning in 2016 or early 2017, in which the Democrats, in league with the CIA and FBI, clearly tried to drive Trump out of office on trumped-up charges of colluding with Russia. Those charges were completely bogus. As much as I hate to side with Donald Trump, he was clearly the victim of a campaign that was aimed at terminating his presidency. And now the Republicans are going to strike back with a vengeance and try to do the same thing to Joe Biden. And Biden is highly vulnerable because these corruption charges involving his son's business activities seem to be strongly based, have a strong, evidentiary base. And so the Republicans are declaring war. And the more they declare war, the more the showdown intensifies, and the more impatient everybody becomes, and therefore the greater the greater the tendency to resort to extra constitutional, undemocratic means. Mm-hmm. And we'll see more of that.
Mm-hmm. Now, on the matter of the very important matter of foreign policy, Daniel, Washington's foreign policy seems to be obsessed with stoking war in Ukraine with Russia and conflict with China over Taiwan. So my question is this militarism of the United States at a time of severe neglect of American public needs, is this kind of obsessive, irrational militarism a wake-up sign that US capitalism is a pathological system?
Well, yeah, yes, it is. I mean, essentially, all heavily militarized imperialist countries tend to are always accompanied by rising levels of poverty, injustice, poor government services at home, as the population is told that that glory comes from military successes overseas. So the more the country pours its resources into militarism and imperial expansion, the less attention it pays towards actual social upkeep at home. And so the condition for the population plunges as a direct consequence of military adventurism abroad. Mm-hmm. And so we're seeing that in the U.S. I mean, under Joe Biden, the U.S. has adopted a very aggressive military posture, in many ways more aggressive than that under Donald Trump. And as a result, the U.S. has provoked this confrontation in the Ukraine. I do not approve of Putin's special military operation. Let me make that crystal clear. However, there's little doubt that what caused Putin to react in this way was NATO's relentless expansion to the east. And if the shoe had been on the other foot, if, for example, Russia was engaging in a military alliance with Mexico, I mean, the U.S. response would have been, you know, as extreme as one could possibly imagine. The F-16s would have been scrambling instantaneously. The U.S. would have responded with all its military power. There's just no doubt. So Putin responded, and the U.S. somehow can't understand why Putin would respond to similar provocations in his own backyard. And the U.S. is doing the same thing in the Western Pacific with regard to China. I mean, essentially, the U.S. is so determined to defend its global hegemony that it is stepping up its aggressive actions at anybody it sees as challenging this global authority. Mm-hmm. So Russia, China, even small countries like Venezuela and Nicaragua, and certainly Iran. I mean, these countries are all feeling the heat of from an empire that is determined to maintain its grip on global power and is increasingly intolerant of anything that challenges that hegemony.
Finally, Daniel, let me ask you a two-part question. Would you say the pathological condition of U.S. capitalism as we're witnessing, would you see it as a terminally diseased condition? And secondly, what's the cure? If that's the case, what is the cure in the biggest sense of the meaning?
Yes, it is terminal. I mean, yes, U.S. democracy is breaking down. Government is breaking down. There is no solution to the problem short of authoritarianism. And authoritarianism, of course, is no solution because that'll simply intensify the breakdown and decay. I mean, so if Trump is reelected in 2024, believe me, things will only get much worse than they already are. But they will get worse regardless of who was elected in 2024. That's very important. And in terms of foreign affairs, the U.S., as you say, is seemingly intent on provoking China as it has already provoked Russia. But a military confrontation with China would be a catastrophe of the first order. I mean, the possibility of nuclear warfare, of course, would be quite real, and that is just utterly horrifying. But also, China is a very well-armed country in its own corner of the world. The U.S. military may be preeminent in global terms, but it's not preeminent in local terms. In other words, if the U.S. ventures into China's backyard, it'll have a very hard time dealing with the Chinese military. And so therefore, a U.S.-Chinese military confrontation could be disastrous. I mean, it certainly, in fact, not could be, it certainly would be disastrous. But yet the U.S. is seemingly intent on sparking this kind of confrontation. And is seemingly incapable of moderating its policies, of pulling back, of making room for China's regional aspirations, for accommodating China's legitimate security concerns, just as it was unable to accommodate Russia's legitimate security concerns. So it's a disaster both domestically and in terms of foreign policy.
So what's the cure, Daniel? How would one go? How does a country go about avoiding that seemingly inevitable disaster of confrontation and war? What's the solution? Widespread worker organization, to reject the two-party system, and to create their own representative parties, or what? What do you see as being some way to ameliorate the American disease, to go beyond it?
Look, my belief is America is headed for revolution. It's either headed for revolution or for some kind of right-wing authoritarianism. The American constitutional system is completely played out. As I said before, it's 235 years old. It's actually increasingly rigid and unchangeable as it ages. So a 235-year-old system that is more rigid, more change averse, the older it gets, is a recipe for disaster. And that's the situation the U.S. finds itself in. The constitutional system is impossible to change from within. I mean, it's based. I mean, it's an 18th century document. It was drafted by slave owners. I mean, it reflects a political worldview which is miles away from the needs of a modern society. Miles.
Do you see, Daniel, any signs of this a revolution that you're forecasting? Do you see a groundswell towards radical upheaval in a progressive sense?
Only in the earliest stages. I mean, first of all, there's a growing dismay over the democratic breakdown, a deepening pessimism as concerning the chances of putting government back in order, a growing sense that democracy is in crisis, that the Democratic majority is stymied at every turn, and that nothing can be done to fix this. Meanwhile, wages are falling, poverty is growing. Real wages have fallen 4.4%, I believe, since Joe Biden took office. That's a hell of a hit. It has not manifested itself as yet in any kind of mass working class upsurge. That is quite correct, but that could change very quickly. And I think it really will change because the American working class is being hit hard from every angle in terms of wages, in terms of living conditions, in terms of the very democratic fabric of the average person's life.
And do you see a breakthrough involving a kind of a repudiation of both parties of the two-party system? Is that what's required? That there a popular realization that the two-party system and the antiquated constitutional framework is no longer acceptable or no longer feasible?
Well, I think that the two-party system is already being repudiated, and that shows up in growing abstention rates in terms of elections. I mean, fewer and fewer people see any point in going to the polls. So I think that itself is a repudiation of the two-party system. As to repudiation of the constitutional system, the trouble is that would require a revolution. In other words, it would require overthrowing the document that is the foundation of American political life, the foundation of every law in the country, no matter how minor or trivial. It would involve tossing it out and starting over from scratch. And that is a revolutionary act. And that would require a giant upsurge. To me, it would be a 1789 moment, if not a 1917 moment. I mean, but as seemingly far-fetched as that may be at the moment, we know that logically there's no alternative, and so logically that moment is approaching. And remember, I mean, Russia in 1917 was a relatively peripheral country. France in 1789 was not. It was the intellectual center of Europe, the diplomatic center, the economic center, with the possible exception of Great Britain. And this is a country that was then completely torn apart by revolution and utterly transformed over a very complex, 5-year period from May 1789 to what was it, June 1794. But clearly the U.S. is heading for that kind of moment. I mean, may sound far-fetched. I'm sure it does sound far-fetched. But nonetheless, when you have
a second revolution.
Yeah, but nonetheless, when you have a system of government that is both completely exhausted and played out, yet is completely unreformable, completely unreformable. Let me emphasize the word completely. I mean, that means that the country, that this kind of revolutionary transformation is being precipitated by these huge internal contradictions in the U.S. system. And it sounds crazy, but I'm absolutely convinced it will happen, and that America, the most conservative state, could become the most revolutionary state. I mean, it happened to Russia. It happened to France. I mean, France was the most powerful, the richest, most powerful monarchy in all of Europe, and then suddenly it collapsed. And Russia was an ultra conservative state, which was completely backwards, seemingly the most inured to change. And then what happened? It suddenly changed overnight. And I am convinced that the U.S. is moving in a similar direction.
Daniel Lazare, thank you for your insights. I think we end on an optimistic note, if not an interesting note. So, Daniel, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.